And now we are ready to have next talk. It will be by Hervás, and he's going to speak about one of the most difficult thing in programming, which is naming. So please give a warm welcome to Daniel.
Hello. All right. So hello everyone. Thanks for coming, and thanks to the organizer for inviting me. Today I'm going to be talking about naming, why it's important, and how to do it right. This is part of the beginner's track, so it's meant primarily for junior devs, people who are in university, people coming out of boot camps, that kind of stuff. So experienced developers might not get as much out of this, so I'm not going to be revealing any big secrets or any deep tech. But it is nonetheless something important. And I think that even the more experienced of you might find some fun in thinking a bit about the importance of naming, which I think it's something that it's widely agreed upon, that it's very important. This is probably the second time that you get to see this quote today. If you've attended Miroslav's talk at the beginning of the conference, this quote also appeared. So I guess that's testament enough to how important naming actually is. Let me first talk a bit about why naming is important, I guess, or why I wanted to speak about this concretely to more junior people. So naming in general, it's not a topic that's, you won't find many talks about naming, or it's not something that's explicitly called upon in many tech conferences or not in many books. So the type of code that you will usually see when you open a programming textbook, like concretely algorithm ones and stuff like that. So academic type of code is usually written in a very particular kind of way, also because it's very abstract in nature. It's dealing with things that are not as concrete as what you will find in your day-to-day programming activities if you get a role as a software engineer. So although it's very important, it's not usually emphasized enough in my experience. At least that's what I found in junior devs. These days I do a lot of PR reviews. I pair program with junior developers, and one of the most common changes that I see that I have to make, or one of the things that newer devs have to get used to when they start working in real software dev projects, is getting naming properly. And this is partly because the code that you see right now on the presentation is usually more or less what you will find, or at least what I found when I was developing, when I was a student, or if you're a competitive programmer, you like competitive programmer, you like to do the leak code type of problems, you will usually find that this is more or less what you see. On the left, you see the trapping rainwater exercise, which is notoriously one of the trickier ones. And you'll notice that this is a type of code that it's kind of impossible to decipher if you don't know what you're talking about beforehand, or if you don't know what the algorithm is about before you read it. It's kind of hard, or maybe even impossible, to figure out what this is about. We'll go into the reasons why, but you can probably now see that you have L, for example, IH in enumerate, L brackets I. Like, no one can read that, really. You need to make a lot of mental effort to follow up with this. On the right, you have the bubble sort implementation, or at least one of them. And that one is, I guess, slightly better, because it does have some comments that help you follow through. We'll talk more about comments later. But this is also a type of programming, let's say, methodology that it's not as common in production code. You won't find large code blocks, usually, because hopefully you won't need to. So what can we do to learn how to name things properly, or what things can you do to put proper names into your variables. There's not a bullet point list or a step-by-step guide I can give you, or no one can give you, on how to name things properly, which is one of the reasons why this is usually not talked about enough, because there's no magic recipe and there's no step-by-step guide on producing all the time consistently a perfect name. What I can show you is some patterns that usually appear or come up in bad names, or some things that you might want to avoid when you're giving names to things, so that you're attentive to it and that you can pay attention and see and recognize them in your code and hopefully improve a little bit. So the first one and the most important, if there's one thing that you take out of this talk, let it be this one. Avoid generic names. Things like var, data. This doesn't really mean anything. It's not saying anything. So when we write code, what we want to do is communicate with other human who is reading that code. You don't write code for yourself. And even if you do write code for yourself, you're not being kind to future you if you choose these kinds of names, okay? So, the point of naming your variables is that you are able to recognize and to immediately read the code that you're writing in the future, or other people are able to interpret it properly. No one can tell, like data, for example, is generally not a good name, because what isn't data? What type of, what entity doesn't fall under the huge umbrella that data opens? Same goes for like item or process for a function name. If you name a function process whatever, you're not really saying anything. You may be tricking yourself into thinking that, oh, my function does it, but really function in and of itself, it's a synonym to process. So your process function could be doing literally any type of mechanism, and you wouldn't know any better. Same goes for counters like I, J, X. Even if you're counting something very simple, it's usually good to be kind to the people who read the code and give meaningful names to those things or to that counter that you're carrying. So whenever possible, and it might not always be possible depending on how abstract the nature of your code is, but whenever possible, if you're naming a variable, try to use a concrete noun. So what are you talking about concretely? Like a car, a dog, whatever. It could be anything, but it needs to be, try to use a noun, try to use an entity, a concrete entity to assign to that variable. For function names, try to use an action verb that means something, or that at least narrows down the scope of what your function is actually doing. So for example, render, post, get. If I see throw, I know that you're probably meaning something like an exception or something of the sort. If I see post, I know that you probably mean that you're making a REST call, a post to an API. So those are more concrete names that help you kind of explain better what your function is doing. Another thing that I want to mention is be specific. When you use variable names, don't think about how long those names are. I mean, up to a point, but generally, the longer, like you shouldn't be thinking about how long your name is. You need to think about how concrete and precise your name is. So if you see the first example, for I in range 131 process data, you wouldn't be able, like nobody would be able to tell me what that is doing. It's completely impossible. It could be doing literally anything. So that's pretty bad. So I'm going to take this very dumb and kind of business logic extent example, and I'm going to carry it over a few slides so you see how we can make improvements upon it, and we can come up with something that you might be able to tell what it does by the end of the presentation. So the first change I want to make is, let's change the name process data to, and I made this up, but print average temperature per day. Okay, that's a fairly long name, and one that you might not be used to seeing if, again, you're doing competitive programming or you haven't found this type of thing before, but this is much better than before. I know now that you're printing something, probably to the console, and I know that, well, I have an average in there, which might be useful depending on the context, and I know that I'm apparently using per day, so I guess there's some sort of time range in there. We'll see later. So we've already made good improvements, but we can probably do more. Another thing that I want to mention is if you can name something, it's probably a good idea to do it. You can get to a point where it's not ergonomic anymore, and when you are naming more things that you really need to, but it's rare. So for example, if you're very sharp, you might have noticed in the slide before that 131 probably accounts for the days of the month. Now I know not every month has like 30 days, but bear with me. So in order to make that more explicit, which is the point of the Zen of Python, and this is again probably the second time this gets mentioned in this conference, if you've been to the previous talks. Explicit is better than implicit. So although you can probably implicitly infer that the range was referring to the days of the month, it was not explicitly mentioned anywhere. So having to make assumptions about code is what leads to like 90% of bugs. If you can make something explicit, generally do it. It's very in the spirit of Python and in general in the spirit of good programming. So for this, I've just taken the name for days in month, and I've replaced the variable for day, which is what we actually mean. So now that we've seen a little bit of how you can prolong your variable names and how you can, I guess, flesh them out, I want to take a look at this example from, I guess, the other side of the coin. So is it possible to write too much or to give unnecessary information? And it is. I think the clearest example of this you'll find at the bottom. So if you have something like a user class, and for every possible item you're prepending user, that's good, that's explicit, but you don't really need to do that. You're repeating yourself. And another one of the principles of programming that's quite good to follow is don't repeat yourself. So, so that's probably too much. Now, of course, this is, I guess, very blunt and very ham-fisted because our user class only has like 3 parameters and 3 are prepended. So this is like, very evident, but I guarantee you that you will find things, maybe not with classes, but with dictionaries and maybe JSON objects, where this type of thing happens, like constantly. So it's good to keep an eye on that. Apart from that, if we take our previous function and we use keyword parameters, which you should be using, and it's one of the things that I think is in general good practice. If you're writing a function, using a keyword parameter is probably or running your parameters as keywords is probably a good idea. The reason is that, again, it's explicit, and explicit is better than implicit. So in this case, however, I think you can argue whether this is too much, because if you read that function, the last 3 words there are date. So I think the concept is clear enough to where we don't need to repeat this 3 times. It's arguable. I think there's nothing inherently wrong, but in the case of this function being completely isolated and not having anything in its code that also does a similar thing where you might need to differentiate, you should probably use type hinting, or you can use type hinting for clarity, and you might be able to omit the per day suffix if you don't think it's strictly necessary, and the signature of the function is enough clarification for you to understand that. It's a bit more, it's slightly debatable, and I think here we enter in the in a kind of holy word type of topic, which is it good for languages to be typed, and how much should typing go into the language syntax? You can ask like the JavaScript/TypeScript community how they're handling that debate. I guess not the topic of this talk. In general, my point of view is that knowing the type of the variable is usually a good thing. If you can convey it through built-in language mechanisms, all the better. If you can't, for whatever reason, it's worth thinking about whether to include the shape or the type of the variable in the naming. I guess that I kind of leave it more up to discussion, but something to think about. Another type of unnecessary information that you might find, and this is more important, I think, and probably more common, is leaking implementation details in a way. Now, I think the clearest example I can give is the Python sort function. So when you're sorting, or when you call upon the sort function or sort it, you don't really care which underlying mechanism the sort function is using. It's just not something that you don't need to be concerned about the implementation details of this function to use it. So notice how they don't really make you call quick sort or sort underscore quick or anything like that. Sort is just fine for the purposes. And underneath the hood, Python, for its sorting function, might be using quicksort or bubble sort or whatever. We don't really care. So when you are writing your own code, take into account or think about at which point writing too much information might be leaking details about the implementation of your own code that the user doesn't really need to know, or the people who access your code doesn't really need to know about. That's unnecessary information that might, in cases, even be confusing. And what you see below is actually a real example. I saw this the other day. So as you see, the name that we have there in that function is AWS Elasticache Redis Endpoint. On paper, that's pretty good. It's a very precise name. It narrows down a lot the scope of the variable that we want to set. This is an environment variable, and so I guess following the rules that we've set before, this would definitely pass. This looks fine to me. It's very descriptive and very precise. However, it's also kind of wrong. In this concrete case, there is no need for this variable to actually be an AWS Elasticache endpoint. If you receive a list of environment variables and you're reading through some code, you receive the environment variables, and you see a gap for AWS Elasticache Redis Endpoint, you would think, all right, I need to fill this variable here with an AWS Elasticache Redis Endpoint. That is actually not the case in this piece of code that I'm showing here. So what's happening here is that some details about the implementation of the concrete code is being leaked. By leaked, I mean it's unnecessary information and one that also causes confusion, because you don't really need this to be an AWS endpoint. So it's kind of misleading. In fact, sometimes it won't be. It might be a local variable. It might be in other, like, a cloud provider. It could be anything as long as it's a Redis URL, which is what we actually need. So although I really like this variable in principle, this falls under the umbrella of unnecessary implementation details, kind of bogging down the name. So I switched it to Redis URL, which is less precise because it's not as concrete, but it's also more accurate because it really explains what this actually needs. It needs any kind of Redis URL, could be anywhere. So this is another one of the places where you can find unnecessary information. So another thing that I want to mention is the topic of comments. Normally, I got taught when I was studying at university and when I was taught programming that commenting code is very good and you should do it. And that's true, but it's not necessarily always true. So good names and readable code, it's much preferable to commenting your code. So if you feel the need to explain your code through comments and not through code itself, you might be doing something wrong, or your names might not be as explicit as they should. Not always the case, but your mindset should be that you shouldn't need comments. You probably only want them for specific cases. And what we have here is actually a counterexample of this. So it's a case where you would actually need comments to understand what's happening. This is the infamous reverse square root function from Quake 3. I know it's not Python, but for the purposes of this talk, this will do. And this was very famous. This was got very popular because of the obvious comment there. And it's 100% correct. It's impossible to know what this is if you don't have comments that explain it. Now, notice the function signature. Remember when I said that you probably should give your names concrete nouns if you are working with a variable? You should use a noun to, or the closest noun that you have to assign to that variable. So it's a cat, a dog. In this case, it's a number. So float number, it's pretty good. It's just so abstract and so convoluted in nature that it's impossible to know any better. Like this is, if you notice the comment evil floating point bit level hacking, like sure, I can see that, but that doesn't explain anything to me about what this is actually doing. So this is a good counterexample, and one of the cases in which you might want to bring comments into your code when the abstract nature of what you're doing is such that it's impossible to tell by the names of it what it actually is. That's when you might include a comment block and say, this is this and this is that. Usually to be avoided, but this is a very good counterexample. I think, by the way, the bubble sort example I showed before is probably also a good case for this. Sorting algorithms are very abstract in nature. You are sorting things very generically. You could be sorting anything. So in that case, it's probably good to have some comments explaining, because you won't be able to narrow down the scope of the workings of the algorithm without helping yourself with comments. Okay, so to finish, I want to show a kind of example of how good naming might help you write better code. This is not the most advanced example, and this is very blunt and very evident when you see it. But let's imagine that you want to print the average temperature and notify users for whatever reason. If your function has the original name that we saw before, like process items or process data, you probably wouldn't think too much of this. You would just add another parameter to your function, and that would be it. And what's happening here is that your function is now doing two completely different things, which probably don't have much to do with one another. And you're kind of breaking one of the good practices of programming, which is that functions, if possible, should do one thing and one thing only. When you name it properly, and when you can see that these two things have nothing to do with each other, it's pretty easy to see that these two concerns should be separated. And if we do so, we also get some bonuses on top of that, which is, like you see, we've kind of decoupled the payload of the notification. So in the first function, whatever is being sent to those user IDs is hidden from us. If you want to modify that someday, you will have to go into the code of that function and change it up manually. Whereas in the last example, you've decoupled the functionality from the parent function. You can call that function whatever, and you can send whatever you need. So it's not restricted to the scope of the parent function or what the parent function was initially. This also, if you want to visualize it in a more concrete way, if you try to write tests for the first function, you will find that you cannot really switch up your payloads, or that if you want to notify users for not the average temperature, but the average, I don't know, pressure, you'll have to write the exact same logic that you would have in the first function into the body of the second. Whereas now you've decoupled that, and you're able to call the same function twice with different parameters, which makes it both easier to test and more modular, so you won't repeat yourself. So I think that's almost all. There's just one extra thing I want to mention. I think the most the more advanced programmers in the room might have noticed kind of an elephant in the room maybe, which is that the print average temperature notify user function doesn't require anything about the temperature. So If you've been thinking about that, or if that has crossed your mind, you get a cookie. So that's entirely true. And this is one other of the things that good naming might help you with, which is making evident that it's possible that you might want to do some of the good old dependency injection here and pass the parameter or pass whatever you need to calculate the temperature into the function so that the function does it. Again, if you think about testing this, how would you test different types of temperatures? How would you test if the temperature is a string or an integer? You wouldn't really be able to. So that's one of the things that maybe, it of course depends a lot on what this actually is doing, which we don't know. But it's one of the things that you might want to also look out for, and one of the things that good naming might help you with. All right, so we've seen a lot of things. I know some of them might sound contradictory if you're very new, but if I want you to take something from this talk is basically that, one, naming is hard. No one has solved it, and no one ever will, because it doesn't deal with concrete mathematical. It's not mathematical in nature. It's up for interpretation. It's semantics. So you cannot really finish or have a final, like, concrete, definitive solution to the perfect variable name. So if any day you open up a request and you see that someone thinks all of your names are wrong and they want to change them, don't get discouraged. Don't think that you're doing something wrong. It's probably very normal. It's a step that you kind of have to take, and it's a very different mindset from maybe the competitive programming type of mindset or of programming style. Whereas in competitive programming, you're encouraged to write short variable names to have your code ready as soon as possible, and you're never going to revisit that code again. The code that you need for production environments is much more reusable. Many people will have to read it. So it might take a bit to switch up that mindset. It did for me. So don't get discouraged if that happens. And yeah, if there's one thing that I think is good to know or good to take into account for naming is have your names be as long as they need. Don't use abbreviations unless strictly necessary. Explicit is better than implicit, so do all the naming that you can. Let it be as long as it needs to be, and think about the code that you're writing as if someone else was to read it, because they probably will have to. So yeah, I think that's all I had for today. Yep, hope you enjoyed it.
All right, so thanks, Daniel, for your talk. We have a question. So what is your approach to changing variable names after your colleagues? Are you for it or are you against it?
Yeah, this is a very good question, and this is one of the reasons why naming is kind of contentious, or sometimes it might spark a bit of internal discussion in teams. People might not agree with you, and that's fine. That's something you kind of have to get used to when you work in software engineering teams. People won't think the same as you do. Many people think differently about different pieces of code. And in the end, sometimes you might not even have a consensus at the end of the day, and you will have to disagree and commit to whatever in the end is the best way to go, or a good enough way to go forward. So in general, I think this is something that leans into team dynamics, I guess. It depends on how your team operates, but it's something that I think it's worth bringing up in pull requests. And then you can discuss there, hopefully with the help of someone else, like a third party, who can also read both your suggestions and then pick. I would say in general, and not just for naming, but in general, don't get too attached to your own ideas. Being a programmer means being able to hold opinions, I guess, a bit loosely. It's good to be opinionated. It's good to have good reasons why you want to do things. Just don't attach your ego to it. Don't think that it's personal. And if you need to let something go, be prepared for it. So to answer the question briefly, I think I'm generally pro. If you have a good reason why you want to change the name of that some of your colleagues wrote, do it. Bring it up, let them know, and that will hopefully spark a discussion within the team. And you should all be adults enough to handle the disagreements if they happen. Easier said than done, but that should be the goal.
All right, we have a few more questions. So what are your thoughts on the common practice of using the _df suffix when working with pandas, PySpark data frames?
Good question. So I think it's probably good. So I'm not an expert, like I'm not an ML engineer or a data engineer, so I don't have like a good, like a very wide experience with this. But in my opinion, it probably is okay. As I mentioned before with suffixes, I'm usually pro being as explicit as you can, even if it means a bit of repetition, even if it means you're saying the same thing twice, or even if it might be too obvious. I think in general it's good practice to be as explicit as you can. And at first glance, it does seem to me that if you can explicitly note that you're referring to a data frame, you do it. So in general, it does seem to me like a good idea, but people who have more experience with this, more concrete experience with this than me, might disagree, and they probably have reasons for it. My knee-jerk reaction, probably okay.
Right. Any favorite case, like a camel snake from the readability perspective?
Not really. For Python, yes, definitely. For Python snake case, I think it's widely agreed upon to be the Pythonic way of writing names. But I don't have any strong opinions of this in a more general or broad sense. The JavaScript community seems to like camel case a lot. I don't really have a problem with that. I think that's fine. I don't think any of the two are more readable than the other. This is where consistency and readability, consistency within the same variable that you choose for, not only for your project, but the wider community comes into account. So when in Rome, do as the Romans. If you're writing Python, probably write snake case. If you're running another language where camel case is more prevalent, write camel case. Don't get too attached to any of the two ways. Yeah, no particular preference, but for Python, definitely snake case.
Okay, so what is the longest variable or function name that you encountered in the wild?
This is very good. I cannot show it. I cannot show it. I'll let you figure out why, but I cannot show it. There's one very funny one, though, which is in Java, which it's like a very, I don't know if I'll be able to find it, but it's like a huge name, which is like factory Java bean, and it takes up the entire screen. I don't know if you've seen it, but that one is pretty funny. And the funniest part is that it does make some kind of sense. If you know Java and you read the entire name, you can kind of figure out that the name means something. But it's probably, I don't know how many characters long. It's probably like 7 words stapled together, all having to do with like OOP concepts. So it's like, I don't know, observer, factory, Java bean, singleton, whatever. And I think it was part of the Java standard library too. So that one was pretty funny. But yeah, the real one, longest real one that I've seen, I'm afraid I cannot show that.
Okay, so what do you think about typing when assigning new variable inside functions? And there is an example.
I think it's probably fine. Like, again, I'm pro being explicit with everything you do. So if you want to be as explicit as possible, I'm pro. Now, I haven't seen this be very common. I haven't found this in many places. Normally, that is because hopefully within the body of a function, you're not declaring enough variables or doing enough things where the type or the shape of the variable that you're assigning is wild enough, or it's like your mental stack when working with a variable hopefully won't be enough to the point where you'll have to type everything that you do into that function. If that is the case, it's possible that your function is doing too much. So I don't find this being as common, but I think it's fine. I think it's probably good. Being explicit is fine, and I don't think anyone would have gripes with explicitly typing whatever it is you're writing.
Okay, so
yeah, that was probably too optimistic of a comment. I do agree, but
yeah, we probably touched about this one, but maybe you want to say something. What about naming variables different weight based on from where they coming from? Camel case for a local scope, snake case for a variables fetched from database, popular in different languages.
Yeah, I've actually written a lot of code using that, actually that very same convention. I do like it. I think it makes things clear. And as long as those boundaries are well set, I think it's probably good. I've done that same thing myself. Yeah, probably good. If you've seen in the presentation, I wrote the days of month as all caps. It's one of the, I guess, unnamed conventions where your constants or things that won't usually change will be uppercase. That is one such thing where you're kind of breaking the rules in a way in order to make things more understandable. I think I'm not opposed to it. I think it's good. I've used that same methodology myself sometimes, and I don't see anything wrong with it. I think it's probably okay. Yeah, when people join the project or when other people are working on it, that should be in the README or something, or at least, I mean, hopefully people will be able to tell so that they don't break this convention when they write their own code, which is when things would start getting messy. So if this convention is bound to break, then you might have to just give in and not segregate your variable names. But if you have a cohesive enough workflow or team where you can keep this consistent, I think it's probably okay.
Okay, do you find inner functions improving readability at all? Should they be used if they are not necessary?
This is a very interesting question, which is probably too dependent on context to answer definitively. So I think it depends a lot on what your function is doing. My gut instinct is that if you do need to define inner functions, it's possible that you are doing too many things within your function, or that your function is way too complex, and you're probably, your function is probably way too complex and you're doing more than you should, which is why you feel the need to extrapolate a block outside of the main body of the function or of the main steps of the function. Now, sometimes it's impossible to avoid this complexity, and sometimes it's just what it is, and there are good reasons there might be good reasons for having inline, or sorry, not inline, inner body functions. I don't really have a definitive answer for this one. I think it'll depend on context, and it's not a thing where I'm brave enough to say never do it, because I've done it myself, and some things I kind of have, sometimes I kind of have been able to justify it. So I don't really have an answer for this. I guess proceed with caution, but slightly discouraged, but and think about what you're doing deeply to see if you really need that inner function, but it's, I guess, not prohibited.
Okay, we have the last question, but we are out of the time, so if you can keep it really, really short so you can answer. So what are your thoughts about using emojis as variable names?
No.
So thank you, Daniel.